Okay. Hi everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and wait here for a couple minutes, probably 1 to 2 minutes, just to give everyone a chance to come in before we go ahead and get started. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and get started, but we're gonna take a couple minutes on the first slide. So if people are still trickling in, then they will have a chance to see the full PowerPoint. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So, like I said, gonna go ahead and just get started. So hello everyone. My name is Kai and welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on navigating the IRB. So this webinar will be recorded, so you will have a chance to go back and watch it later. But if anyone has any questions throughout, there's a little Q&A section on Zoom that you can type some questions out in, and then I'm going to do a little Q&A at the end, and so I'll get to everyone's questions at the end. Also, if anyone wants to stick around to the last slide of the PowerPoint, so I'm going to have more information on how Statistics Solutions as a company can help you with your project or your dissertation. So I'll have some contact information and a little bit more information on the last slide for that. Okay. And it looks like in terms of people here, it's slowed down on people joining. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Okay. So today, like I said before, we're going to be discussing the IRB. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the IRB and the 3 ethical principles that kind of govern the IRB. Next, we're going to talk about what exactly is the IRB. And then we'll get into kind of the 3 most important categories of the IRB. And so that's privacy and confidentiality, informed consent, and then assessing risk. And then finally, at the end, we're going to talk about the 3 different types of IRB review categories that you could be placed into and kind of what the next steps are based on that. Okay. So to start, we're going to talk about the Belmont Report. So the Belmont Report is the foundational document for the current human subjects testing and protocols in the United States. So it was created in 1979 as a response to many of the unethical research practices on fellow humans, both in the United States and worldwide. And therefore, the Belmont Report lays out 3 ethical principles to follow when conducting human subjects research. So the first is respect for persons. The second is beneficence. And the third is justice. And the next couple slides, we're going to go through each one in depth, one by one. Okay. So first off is respect for persons. So respect for persons states that human participants are autonomous beings who are free to choose to participate or to withdraw from a research study at any time. So for the participant to be able to make the choice to participate or to withdraw, the researchers then must provide the participants with all of the necessary information of the study. And so this can include the purpose of the study, what the individual is expected to do, and any potential risks of harm that would occur while the individual is in the study. Additionally, respect for persons also argues that those who do not have autonomy, such as children or prison inmates, must have additional protections. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So next is beneficience. Beneficience refers to the idea of harm reduction. And so researchers should do their best to maximize the possible benefits of research while minimizing the potential risks involved. And so this means that the potential harm must be reasonable in comparison to the expected benefits of the information learned. And so a good example of this is I like to always talk about my dissertation when I was still in school, like 2 years ago now, which is crazy. But so I was running a study on misinformation. And so what it included me lying to my participants, and almost trying to trick them into believing information that they were never presented, and believing that they did actually see that information and that information was correct. And so that could be a possible risk here. And so that's because some of the most common risks in human subjects research is psychological stress or embarrassment, or breaches of privacy and confidentiality. And so with the misinformation study with lying, that kind of falls under the psychological stress or embarrassment subsection. And so it could be stressful for participants to almost realize that they are being lied to. And therefore, the benefits of lying to those participants needs to outweigh the harm that lying could do to them. So something like lying isn't as necessarily harmful as something like an electric shock would be. So, if an electric shock is an example of like the Milgram shock experiment. And with lying, our benefit was, oh, well, misinformation is rampant. This was in 2020. Misinformation is rampant, especially online. There is a lot of benefits to understanding when and why people believe this misinformation. And that's what my specific study was about. Whereas if you compare it to like the Milgram shock experiment, while that was an experiment that happened and was validated at the time, is completely unethical for today's standards, because the risk of shocking someone and the potential stress and pain, even if it was lying, even though they lied about shocking someone, the potential stress and pain of knowing that they were responsible, and I put that in quotations because they were lying, could definitely, not just could, but definitely outweighs the benefits of learning that people are obedient. Specifically with the Milgram shock experiment, there have been many studies since that have shown that those people were deeply traumatized. And it does not, and the study doesn't even replicate. So basically what I'm trying to say is we need to basically play a balancing game. What are we doing? Are we lying to participants? Are we harming them in any way? What are we doing, and why? Is that necessary to reach the benefit that we want to learn? Okay. And I went a little bit off script for that, but I think it was important. Okay. So finally, the third principle is the principle of justice. And the principle of justice argues that the burden of research must be equally distributed, and that certain populations should not endure the harm for others to benefit from. So many studies in the past have ignored this principle. The most notable examples in recent or semi-recent years are the Nazi experiments on those in concentration camps, and the US government's syphilis experiments on the African-American community, or the Tuskegee syphilis study in the US. So these examples and these experiments were conducted on very specific populations who were basically unable to say no. And then the effects of that knowledge, however, has impacted much larger populations. And so because of these studies and many others like them, researchers have discouraged from conducting research on convenient populations, such as students in their own classrooms or prison inmates who aren't able to say no. Okay. So that's kind of the history of kind of how we got to the IRB. So next I want to talk more specifically about the IRB. So what exactly is an IRB? The IRB, or an institutional review board, is an ethical committee in a particular institution. And this committee's job is to review research involving human participants for the ethical standards that we talked about before. So beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And they also have their own guidelines outlined by the institution. And so each IRB board or application is going to be slightly different per institution, but the core rules are going to remain the same. And ultimately, what the committee does is they will either approve, reject, or require modifications for the proposed research studies. And we'll get into that in a little bit later. Okay, so when reviewing a research design, an IRB committee members will consider many different ethical guidelines and rules. So one common rule in reviewing is that the privacy and confidentiality of the participants must be maintained. And so what this means is that researchers have an obligation to give the participant control over how much information they share, which is known as privacy, as well as protecting the information that they do choose to disclose, which is known as confidentiality. So on this slide, we're going to talk about privacy, and then on the next slide, we'll talk about confidentiality. So privacy, or having the control over the extent, timing, and circumstances that one shares about themselves, can be breached in a couple different ways. So the first is through different research methods, such as observational studies, focus groups, or snowball sampling. And observational studies pose a threat to privacy if that private information is gathered without the subject's consent or knowledge. So a lot of the times we'll do observational studies on kids or on hospital patients. And if those children or those patients or the parents of those children are unaware that those studies are happening, they may, give information that they wouldn't normally if they didn't think that observational study was happening. And then focus groups, on the other hand, they can't ensure privacy or confidentiality since participants may talk about what was discussed after the study ends. Additionally, privacy invasions can occur if a participant finds the study questions to be too invasive. So questions about sensitive topics, such as abuse, medication, or sexual behavior may serve to make the participant uncomfortable. And studies that include this type of information should include some sort of warning in the consent form. Okay. So confidentiality, on the other hand, is defined as the treatment of information that an individual has disclosed with the expectation that it will not be divulged to others. So one simple way of protecting confidentiality is to de-identify your participants' information. And what that means is to assign numbers to participants to make sure that the personal information that they have disclosed cannot be traced back to their legal name. Additionally, how data and information will be protected should be outlined in clear writing in the consent form. And the most common form of protecting data and information is to keep it on a private drive or a filing cabinet if you're feeling old school. And then only allowing those who are essential to access that information. And like I said, the IRB requires that these protections and any potential risks of those protections of privacy and confidentiality are outlined in a consent form. Which kind of brings us to our next slide, which is informed consent. Super important. So kind of the biggest aspect of the IRB is informed consent. And this is the idea that researchers must obtain consent from a participant when running human subjects testing. And this consists of two main parts. So firstly, that the researcher has an obligation to inform participants of all of the key information of the study so they can make an informed decision on whether or not to participate. So this means that participants should be reasonably informed on the study's purpose, procedures. They should also be informed on any potential harm and expected benefits, how privacy and confidentiality will be maintained, and any incentives that they will receive as taking part of the research. Additionally, this consent form should provide a statement indicating that the study is voluntary and that participants can withdraw at any time without any penalty. And any contact information of the head researcher should be included if participants later down the line have any questions. All of this information should be presented in a very clear and simple manner so that anyone who is not familiar with the study can understand what they are consenting to. And also participants should be given ample time to read the document and make the decision for themselves. They should not have a time limit or feel pressured or coerced in any way. So that's the first part of informed consent. The second part of informed consent is that then the researcher should be providing documentation that this participant did indeed consent to the study procedures and requirements. And so this is usually done by having a signed consent document signed by each participant. So usually it'll just be like a long list of what exactly is the study about? What are you expected to do? What are any of the potential benefits and risks, and how are we going to kind of compensate you? And then from there should have some sort of statement that says something along the lines of like, I attest that I am over the age of 18 and that I am basically cool with this, in way better words than that. And for participants who are not considered to be autonomous, such as children or maybe older individuals in, like, say you're looking at dementia patients, those would not considered to be autonomous people. And therefore, additional safeguards should be set in place to ensure that they are able to consent to the best of their ability. So for the example of participants with dementia, maybe that includes a test of mental competency. Or if we're looking at children, we should be requiring a consent form from a legal guardian or caretaker. Basically, informed consent is incredibly important. And even if in situations like my study, for example, like say my dissertation, which I was talking about earlier, my misinformation study, even though I was lying to participants, I had to very explicitly tell them in the consent form that there was a possibility that they were going to be lied to. I didn't have to directly say, oh, by the way, you're going to be lied to in this study, although some do require that. But I did have to say, there is a potential that you will be lied to in this study, or that you will be deceived in this study. Because we don't want anybody saying yes to anything that they don't fully understand the ramifications of. And that goes in all things in life, not just research, but I digress. Anyway, so next is the idea of minimizing risk and identifying this risk. So the level of risk in a research study can be determined by assessing the likelihood of experiencing harm along with the severity of that harm should it occur. So a researcher should consider the situation and time frame of research, as many sensitive topics can cause harm if asked in areas where it is taboo or illegal. A good example of this is like marijuana studies in places where it's not legal. That could be a potential risk for a participant to answer a question that has to do with marijuana if they're in an illegal state. Additionally, the subject population itself should be accounted for, such as vulnerable or underserved populations who are at a higher risk. Therefore, the goal of a study should be to balance the potential risks with the expected benefits of that information learned. Meaning if there are little benefits to using an abused population, the risk of re-traumatizing them for your study may be too high of a risk. However, if a researcher plans to deceive their participants, aka a misinformation study, to learn a new truth of human behavior, that's level of risk may be deemed as acceptable for that benefit of that new information. So this really goes back to that beneficence thing that we were talking about earlier. That concept of beneficence is that we're trying to balance these potential risks with the potential benefits. And so the level of risk for each study is going to be examined by an IRB committee, and then its members will determine if the study's risk of harm is acceptable, and then they will usually make suggestions on how to change that level of harm when necessary. So my favorite story to tell from my time in grad school is the story of one of my friends. He was a year older than me. In grad school, I was in a psychology program, and he was doing a research study basically on the concept of, if you give an inanimate object, but not really an inanimate object, a name, are you more or less likely to like emotionally bond with that thing? And so what he did, instead of inanimate objects, he did bugs, because bugs are usually considered something to be where people don't really like bugs that much, including me, can't stand them. And usually people find them gross. People are usually revolted by them and very willing to kill them. Now, that's not always the case person by person, but as a general rule, I feel like most people don't like bugs. And so he chose bugs, and what he wanted to do was see if participants in one group who were told to name the bug were more or less likely to kill the bug at the end. And killing the bug is kind of where he ran into a lot of problems. And so originally what he wanted to do was he wanted to see if the participant would quite literally put the bug in a grinder of some kind, like a nut grinder, what those things look like, and basically grind it up. And the IRB kind of came back to him and said, absolutely not. This is a huge risk of traumatizing people. Like you've asked someone to give a bug a name, and then at the end of and asking them to emotionally bond with this bug. And then at the end, you're basically asking them to kill it. And there was kind of a little bit more to his study where they were given money and they could pay a certain amount of money, or however much money they were willing to pay to keep the bug from dying. But, and that was kind of his dependent variable, was how much money are they willing to pay to keep the bug from dying. But the IRB really thought that this was maybe a little bit too severe of a harm that could occur with very little benefits of, fine, you've learned that people are emotionally bonding to things that they named. What really is the benefit of learning this? And so what he had to do was go to the IRB multiple times, and they had to make multiple suggestions on how to change his study so that that level of harm did not occur. And so what they ended up coming to was that they would put a fake bug, and they used pill bugs, which I call roly-polies, if you know what that means, but very small pill bugs. And they put a fake pill bug into a grinder, and then they had the researcher himself grind it. And this was pre-COVID. So it was an in-person study. And so they fake grinded it in front of the person, and they determined that that was a less harmful situation than having the participant themselves pick up the bug, put it in the grinder, and then grind it up themselves. So not only is the bug not dying, and the participants are told that at the end, but they're not doing the physical killing of the bug themselves. And so that's one of my favorite examples on kind of identifying this level of risk and what you can do with the IRB to get around, still running your study, but doing it in a way where we're not completely traumatizing our participants. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to say on this slide is that additional safeguards, going back, additional safeguards such as removing participant identifiers and obtaining consent forms may be suggested by the IRB. Or in the case of my very good friend Jimmy, they would suggest for him to completely redo part of his study. Okay. So finally, we're getting to the review categories. So once an IRB has reviewed the contents of a research study, they're then going to process an experiment under 3 categories. So one is an exempt review, the next is expedited review, and the last is a full board review. So research reviewed as exempt is categorized as a study that involves no more than a minimal level of risk, and therefore does not need further review from the committee. So this could be something where you're just doing a simple human subjects survey. You're doing a manipulation, but it's not a manipulation that seems very stressful or potentially harmful for the participants. Say your manipulation is just that, one group gets to eat jelly beans and the other group doesn't get to eat jelly beans and then they take a survey based on those jelly beans. That was a really weird example, but for some reason I'm really craving jelly beans. And so in that case, the IRB would look at it. They would say, hey, doesn't really seem like there's any risk involved here. Let's go ahead and just approve it. And they'll need no further review and no changes for an exempt review. That kind of is the best case scenario for the IRB because it means that you're spending the least amount of time dealing with them, which, dealing with them is not inherently awful. It's just time consuming and tedious, and you want to get on to the rest of your study as soon as you can. So the next is expedited review. This often involves some level of risk, but this risk is to a minimal degree. So in this case, an IRB member will review the study procedures and then make suggestions on how to minimize that risk. So for example, what we were talking about earlier with my misinformation study that I ran as part of my dissertation, I also had a stress aspect. So not only was I deceiving them, I had a stress aspect to it. So I personally wanted to see if differences in stress affected how likely someone was to basically internalize and believe misinformation. And so my stress test, because of how stressful it seemed, was put under expedited review. And the only thing that I was suggested to make was to make it very, very clear when people were signing up for the study that there was going to be a stress test involved. And so I didn't really have to do too much in terms of changing. I just had to make sure that my listing for the study was clear that stress would be involved, and that my consent form was clear that stress would be involved as well. And so those were the only things I had to change. And then I resubmitted to the IRB, and then they approved it from there. And then full board review involves research that poses a significantly higher risk than what would occur in participants' day-to-day life. And so in this case, a researcher may have to make significant changes to obtain approval or to run their study. And so like I was saying earlier with my friend who had the pill bug study, he definitely had a full board review. his level of stress, killing a bug was, according to the IRB, significantly higher risk than every day. And so he had to, like I said, change his study so that the participants weren't physically killing the pill bug, and it was the researcher who was pretending to kill a fake pill bug. And then finally, an IRB requires that any changes made to a study after it has been approved must be reported back to the committee for another review of risk. And so a good example of this is also with my dissertation study. I mentioned before, I was running my study during the pandemic in 2020 when it first kind of kicked off. And so I had originally had my IRB approved before the pandemic happened, and I was ready to start data collection in person. And I was going to have in-person data collection. They were going to come into my lab. I was going to show them PowerPoint slides, give them a stress test, which it was a math-based stress test. So pretty stressful. And then the pandemic happened and everything shut down for months, and grad school doesn't. And so I had to basically go back to the IRB, tell them that not only was, I changing my study, but I was going to an online format. So then I had to go through the review categories all over again because I was changing my study. But that's just a cute little antidote on always make sure the IRB knows if you've changed your study. That's because what they approved originally, that was an in-person study. The risks of an in-person study are very different than the risks of an online study. And so what they had approved was something that was completely different than what I was actually doing. And so therefore I had to go back to them and basically be like, can you approve me again, please? Thank you. Which is so fun and awesome all the time. Anyway, that is basically all of the information that I have for you guys. Does anyone have any questions about what I shared or anything else about the IRB? There is the chat. I will answer questions through the chat, but I will also answer questions through the little Q&A button on Zoom. Okay, well, while people are typing questions, or if people are typing questions, I don't want to just sit here in silence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our last slide. Maybe. There we go. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about our company. So Statistics Solutions is a full service dissertation consulting company. And we provide graduate students or anyone really with timely editorial support for your dissertations or your scholarly projects. So we do 30-minute free consultation sessions on Monday through Friday to see if, it would be a right fit for you to work with us. Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. If you are interested in talking with us about what we can do to help, you can go ahead and contact Brittany at statisticsolutions.com to set up an appointment with her. Or you can use the phone number on the screen to call and make an appointment that way as well. We as a company do help with not specifically the IRB application, but if people have questions or need help kind of tuning out the fine details, we help with that. We also help with APA editing, results, discussion, all of the fun stuff, literature reviews, all of it. So full service, full dissertation. Okay. Well, it doesn't look like anyone has any questions in the chat. Let me check the Q&A button. Doesn't look like anyone has any questions there either. So I will leave this screen up for like a minute. And then I'm going to go ahead and head out if nobody has any questions. But thank you so much for joining and for listening. And like I said, if you have any questions about what Statistics Solutions can do to help you, the contact information is on the screen. Okay, like I said, that's about all I have for today. So this recording will be available within 24 to 48 hours after the presentation ends. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And hopefully we will see you soon.